What's this supposed to be? The cop flicked the small silver star pinned to her apron. You playing dress up? Think a 5 and dime badge makes you tough? It's not a costume, the waitress said quietly. It belonged to my father. He unclipped it before she could stop him. Turned it over in his fingers like a toy. This thing's a joke. Then he threw it in the trash. In front of the whole diner. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just looked at him, calm as still water, and said 6 words that nobody in that room would forget. 4 days later, that same officer stood frozen in the town square, watching her open a leather folio, watching a gold shield catch the midday light. Captain Josephine Whitman, State Bureau of Internal Affairs, his new commanding officer. And the badge he threw in the trash? It held the one secret that would destroy his family forever. Millhaven doesn't show up on most maps. It has 1 traffic light, 1 grain elevator, 1 diner that's been open since 1962. People here still wave at cars they don't recognize. They still leave their doors unlocked. Most of them still believe hard work and a kept promise will see them through. This is a story about the day that belief got tested. Millhaven had survived floods, twice in the last 30 years. It survived a factory closing that took half the jobs in town. It survived a hard decade after that. 1 funeral at a time. 1 boarded up storefront at a time. But it always came back. That's what small towns do. They don't have anywhere else to be. The diner sat at the heart of it, right on the corner, across from the courthouse. Its neon sign had flickered red every night since before most regulars were born. Rosie's father opened it. Rosie grew up behind that counter. She inherited it the way people inherit land they never asked for, because somebody has to keep the lights on. People in Millhaven trusted a few things without much question. The weather forecast on Channel 9. Their pastor on Sunday mornings, and for a long time they trusted the badge. Wearing one in this town used to mean something good. It starts on a Tuesday morning in October. The smell of bacon, grease, and coffee hung thick over Rosie's diner. The bell over the door had already rung 100 times. Farmers grabbing coffee before the frost lifted. Retirees settling into the booths they'd claimed for 20 years. Nobody paid much attention to the new girl behind the counter. She'd started 3 days earlier. Quiet, polite, a little too careful with the coffee pot, like she was still learning where things belonged. Her name tag said Joe. Just Joe. No last name. She looked 24, maybe 25. Blonde hair pulled back tight. A small silver pin shaped like a 5-point star clipped to her apron strap. Nobody had asked about it yet. That morning they would. But before Grant Hayes walked through that door, there was an hour of ordinary morning. It mattered just as much, even if nobody would remember it later. There was Mildred Vance, 81 years old. She came in every day at 7 sharp. She ordered the same thing she had for 15 years. 2 poached eggs, rye toast. Dry. Mildred had buried a husband and worse, a son. These days she didn't say much to anybody. Over the years, most waitresses learned to set her plate down and let her be. Joe hadn't learned that yet. Or maybe she'd learned something different. On her second morning, Joe noticed Mildred's hands shaking around her coffee cup. She didn't rush past with the next order. She stopped. "Would you like me to warm that up, Mrs. Vance?" Mildred looked up, surprised, like nobody had said her name out loud in a while. "You know my name?" Rosie mentioned it. "Said you take your toast dry. Said you like the corner booth." Something shifted in the old woman's face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than that. The plain relief of being seen. Since then, Mildred stayed a little longer over her coffee. Sometimes she even talked. Small things, her garden. A grandson out west who called most Sundays. Joe always listened like she had nowhere else to be. That Tuesday, Mildred sat in her usual booth when Grant Hayes came through the door. She watched the whole thing unfold from behind her cup. Her old eyes missed nothing. The door opened hard enough to rattle the glass. A young man walked in wearing a police uniform, sunglasses on, even though the sun wasn't up yet. He had the kind of walk that expected the room to notice him. Officer Grant Hayes was 32 years old. 6 years on the Millhaven force. In this town, being a Hayes meant something. His father ran the whole department. Grant slid into a booth by the window. He didn't bother with a menu, he knew it by heart. He just wanted his order taken fast. Joe walked over, notepad already out. "Morning, officer, what can I get you?" "Coffee black." And the usual. Don't let the eggs sit like they did yesterday. I wasn't working yesterday, Joe said. Calm. No edge in it. Grant looked up at her, really looked, for the first time. New girl, he said. Not a question. That's right. Well, new girl, let's get one thing straight. I come in here every morning. I've got a schedule. I don't have time for slow service. I'll do my best to keep it quick. He waved a hand, done with the conversation. Joe turned to put the order in. That should have been the end of it. A mildly rude customer. Nothing worth remembering. But Grant Hayes wasn't finished. 10 minutes later, Joe came back with his plate and his coffee. She carried it careful, the way she'd been taught. As she set the mug down, Grant shifted at the wrong moment. Maybe on purpose, maybe not. Hot coffee splashed across the table, down onto his uniform pants. He stood up fast, coffee dripping off his sleeve. Are you kidding me? I'm so sorry. Joe already reached for a towel. Let me get that. Don't touch me. He stepped back, voice rising. Do you know what this uniform costs? Do you know who you just embarrassed? The diner had gone quiet. Forks stopped moving. A trucker in the corner booth lowered his newspaper. Mildred set down her cup without drinking. It was an accident, officer. I'm happy to cover the cleaning. You're happy to cover it. Grant laughed. Nothing warm in it. You're new, so let me explain how this works. I could write this place up right now. Health code. Safety hazard. I could have this diner closed by lunch. From behind the counter, a woman's voice cut in. Grant, come on now. It's coffee. Accidents happen. That was Rosie Miller, 63 years old. She'd owned this diner for 31 years, ever since her husband passed and left it to her. She wasn't afraid of much, but even she kept her voice careful around a haze. Rosie, I like you, Grant said. I do, but you need to train your new girl better. This is what happens when you hire off the street. He looked back at Joe. His eyes caught on the small silver star pinned to her apron. What's this supposed to be? He flicked it with one finger. You playing dress up? Think a 5 and dime badge makes you tough? It's not a costume, Joe said quietly. It belonged to my father. Something in her voice shifted when she said it. Just slightly. Steed ear. Grant didn't catch it. He wasn't listening that closely. Well, your father should have taught you how to carry a coffee pot. He unclipped the pin before she could stop him, turned it over in his fingers like a toy. This thing's a joke. He tossed it backhanded toward the trash bin by the counter. It missed the rim, landed among the crumpled napkins and coffee grounds inside. For a moment, nobody in the diner said a word. Joe didn't run for the trash can. She didn't cry out. She stood there, hands at her sides. She looked at Grant Hayes for a long, quiet second. You've got coffee on your pants, officer, she said finally. I think that's the worst of your problems this morning. A few people at the counter turned their heads. Someone coughed to cover a laugh. Grant's jaw tightened. You want to watch that mouth, he said. I could make your life very difficult in this town. I believe you, Joe said. But I'm not looking for trouble. I'm just trying to do my job. Grant stared another beat, like he was deciding if she was worth the effort. Then he grabbed a napkin and wiped uselessly at his pants. He dropped a couple of crumpled bills by his plate. Keep the change, he muttered. Buy yourself a personality. The bell over the door rang as he walked out. His cruiser pulled away, tires chirping a little too hard for a quiet street. Behind the wheel, Grant gripped it tighter than the moment called for. He told himself the girl had it coming, mouthing off like that, in front of half the town. He told himself that a dozen times over the 4 blocks back to the station. By the time he pulled into the lot, he almost believed it. Almost. Inside the diner, the room exhaled all at once. Then slow, the ordinary sounds came back. Forks against plates. The hum of the fridge case by the register. A trucker named Pete Larson folded his newspaper. He set a $5 bill on the counter. More than his coffee cost. That boy's got a badge and no business wearing it, Pete muttered, mostly to himself, but loud enough. Nobody answered out loud. A couple of heads nodded anyway. That was how it went in Millhaven. People noticed. People even agreed, quietly, over coffee, in kitchens, in trucks idling at the stoplight. But agreeing quietly and standing up loud were two different things. Most folks here had learned which one kept you out of trouble. Rosie hurried over, wiping her hands on her apron. Honey, I am so sorry. He's like that with everybody. But he's never done that before. Throwing your things around. It's okay, Rosie. It is not okay. Rosie was already crouching by the trash can, fishing through the napkins. Her fingers closed around the small silver star. She pulled it out, wiping it clean on her apron. "Here, this is yours." Joe took it gently, held it in her palm a second longer than she needed to. "Thank you," she said. "It's beautiful. Real silver, isn't it? Old too, by the look of it. It was my father's." "Well, he'd be proud of how you just handled that," Rosie said. "I've seen grown men lose their temper at Grant Hayes, regret it for a year. You just stood there like water off a duck's back." Joe smiled, small and tired. No sense fighting a man who wants a fight. Doesn't end well for anybody. She pinned the star back onto her apron, careful, like it belonged there and nowhere else. From her booth, Mildred Vance set down her coffee cup. She rarely spoke above a murmur these days, but she spoke now, clear enough for nearby tables to hear. "My husband wore a badge for 11 years, Mildred said. "He always told me the good ones never needed to raise their voice." Joe turned toward her, surprised. "Is that right, Mrs. Vance?" "That's right." Mildred picked her cup back up, steady as ever. "You remind me of him a little." "That's not nothing coming from me." It wasn't much, just an old woman's opinion offered quiet over breakfast. But something in Joe's chest eased hearing it. Small kindnesses had a way of landing heavier than people expected. Rosie watched her walk back toward the kitchen. Then she leaned against the counter, just to steady herself. She'd buried a husband in this town. Cancer took Dell 11 years back, the kind of slow that eats a family from the inside, before it ever touches the body. In the 2 years after his funeral, Rosie was close to selling the diner, more than once. The bank would have taken it off her hands. She could have moved somewhere quiet and let somebody else worry about the payroll. She hadn't sold it. Mornings like this one were part of the reason why. Somebody needed a place to be seen and heard and treated decent, even on the worst day of their week. Dell used to say the diner wasn't really in the egg business. It was in the business of making people feel like they mattered. For 20 minutes, anyway, before they went back out into whatever was waiting. Rosie never forgot that. It was why she still opened at 5:30, even at 63, even with a hip that ached worse every winter. It was why she'd hired Joe in the first place. A slow Tuesday 3 weeks back. The girl walked in asking for work. Nothing but a small suitcase, and a story about needing a fresh start. Rosie hadn't fully believed it. She hadn't pushed on it either. Everybody in this town was carrying something. Rosie had learned that much, running a diner for 3 decades. You didn't have to know what it was to treat a person kindly anyway. At the counter, an old man had watched all of it without saying a word. He was 74, with a full head of white hair. His hands still looked strong from a life of work. His name was Walt Higgins. He came into Rosie's every morning at exactly 7:15. 2 eggs over easy rye toast. The paper read front to back before anybody else touched it. Walt hadn't said anything during the whole scene, but his eyes had followed the new girl close. Not the way most people watch a fight, the way a man watches something he's trying to place. Some old memory scratching at the back of his mind. He'd noticed how she stood when Grant got in her face, feet apart, weight balanced, shoulders loose but ready. Not the stance of someone scared, the stance of someone taught how to hold a room. He'd noticed her voice too, steady under pressure, no shake in it at all. And he'd noticed the pin. Walt had been a police officer himself, 31 years on this very force, before he retired a decade back. He knew what that little silver star was. He'd worn one just like it, back before the department switched to the newer badges, back in a different era of Millhaven policing, one most folks in town were too young to remember clearly. He didn't say anything that morning. He just watched Joe finish her shift, refilling cups, clearing plates, moving through the diner like she'd done it her whole life. But something sat wrong in his chest, something he couldn't quite name yet. By lunch rush, the whole diner had heard about the coffee twice over. Word moved fast in a town this size. By the time Junie clocked in for her shift, she already knew every detail. Junie was 22, a laugh that carried across the room, a habit of humming old country songs while she wiped down tables. She'd worked at Rosie's since she was 16, shifts around community college classes, saving up for something bigger she hadn't quite figured out yet. Nursing school, maybe, if she ever saved enough. Or just a car that didn't need a jump start twice a week. Her mother had waited tables at this same counter 20 years back. Her grandmother before that. Some families in Millhaven passed down land. The Sullivans passed down aprons and good instincts for reading a room. I heard Hayes threw your badge in the trash, Junie said. She tied her apron behind her back. That true? It's not a badge, Joe said. Just a pin. Sure looked like a badge to half the people in here. Junie leaned against the counter. You okay? I'm fine. You don't seem shaken up at all. If that had been me, I'd have cried in the cooler for 20 minutes. Joe smiled at that. A real one. No point crying over a man who isn't worth the tears. Well, I'll tell you what. Everybody in this town is a little scared of Grant Hayes. And a lot scared of his daddy. Junie glanced toward the window, lowering her voice out of habit. My mom always says this town used to feel different. Before Chief Hayes took over, says people used to leave their porch lights off at night, not think twice about it. Now half the block leaves them on, like they're waiting on something. Waiting on what? Junie shrugged, tying her hair back. Don't know. Just a feeling, I guess. My mom's not usually wrong about feelings like that. She wiped down the counter for a second, quiet, before speaking again. You ever think about leaving a place like this? Sometimes, Joe said carefully. Why, you thinking about it? Always thinking about it. Nursing school, maybe, over in the next county. Just scared to actually do it, I guess. Junie laughed, a little embarrassed. Everybody I know stays. Feels like leaving would be some kind of betrayal. Staying isn't the only way to love a place, Joe said. Sometimes leaving and coming back stronger is a kind of love, too. Junie looked at her a beat longer than usual, like she hadn't expected such a thoughtful answer from the new girl. That's a nice way to put it. My dad used to say something like it. Sounds like he was a smart man. He was, Joe said quietly. The smartest man I ever knew. His daddy? Franklin Hayes, chief of police. Been running this department going on 15 years. Junie lowered her voice further, though the diner sat mostly empty. There's a big ceremony coming up, Founders Day. Chief Hayes is finally stepping down, handing the department over to somebody new. Whole town's talking about it. Joe kept wiping the counter. Her movement stayed steady. When's that happening? 5 days. Saturday. Whole thing at the town square, right in front of the courthouse. Bagpipes and everything. Junie rolled her eyes. Everybody figures Grant will end up running things eventually anyway, once his daddy retires for good. Man like that, with that kind of family behind him, who's going to stop him? Joe didn't answer. She just kept working, eyes on the counter, mind somewhere else entirely. Outside, the town square was already changing shape for it. Workers strung red, white, and blue bunting along the courthouse railings. A banner went up over Main Street, stretched between 2 lampposts. It read Founders Day, in letters faded from being used every single year. Somebody set folding chairs in neat rows facing a small wooden stage, the same stage that got used for the county fair. And Christmas caroling, and every graduation this town had ever held. Millhaven took its ceremonies seriously, maybe because there wasn't much else to hold on to out here. Not since the factory closed, and the young people started leaving for bigger towns. A ceremony gave people a reason to put on their good coats. It gave them a reason to stand shoulder to shoulder with neighbors. Neighbors they didn't see enough anymore. Whatever else happened this Saturday, the whole town would be there to see it. By midday, trouble arrived from an unexpected direction, though nobody in Rosie's diner expected trouble from a man they'd known for years. Old Dwayne Pratt had been a fixture at the diner longer than Joe had been alive. 70 years old, a farmer his whole life, until his knees gave out and forced him to sell the land 2 winters back. These days he mostly sat at the counter and drank coffee. He had one too many nips from a flask. He thought nobody noticed. He'd clearly started early. He came in loud, arguing with nobody in particular about his water bill. By the time he settled onto his stool, his hands shook with something more than anger. He knocked over the napkin dispenser, reaching for his coffee. Then he knocked over the coffee itself. Dwayne, honey, maybe head home and sleep it off, Rosie said gently. She came around with a rag. I don't need to sleep nothing off, Dwayne snapped. I need my coffee. I need people to quit hovering. His voice climbed. A few customers glanced up. Junie shot Joe a look from across the room. The kind that says this happens sometimes. Give him space. But it didn't stay small. Dwayne stood too fast, swayed and grabbed for the counter to steady himself. His hand landed instead on the knife block. Rosie kept it by the register for slicing pie. His fingers closed around the biggest blade, more out of panic than intent, trying to catch his balance. For one bad second, the knife came up as he stumbled, swinging wide, too close to where Junie stood with a tray of dishes. "Dwayne, watch it!" Rosie shouted. What happened next took 2 seconds, though everyone who saw it would swear later it felt much longer. Jo moved. She crossed the space between the counter and Dwayne before anyone else registered it happening. Her hand closed around his wrist. Not grabbing hard, not hurting him, just redirecting the motion in a smooth, practiced turn. The knife slid from his loosened grip. It clattered harmlessly onto the counter. In the same motion, she guided him gently back onto his stool, one hand steady on his shoulder. "There you go," she said, calm as anything. "Easy now. You're all right." Dwayne blinked up at her, confused, the fight already draining out. "I wasn't going to hurt anybody." "I know you weren't," Jo said. "Let's get you some water." She turned to Junie, standing frozen, dishes still rattling on her tray. "You okay?" Junie nodded, wide-eyed. Yeah, I'm fine." The whole diner went quiet again. Second time in one day. But this silence felt different. Less shock. More something people couldn't quite put into words. Rosie was the one who finally spoke. "Jo, honey, where in the world did you learn to do that?" "Waitressed at a rough bar once," Jo said. She already reached for a glass of water for Dwayne. "You pick things up." It was a good answer. Believable enough. Most people nodded and went back to their lunches, the moment already fading into gossip to share later. A little while after, once the diner settled back into rhythm, Dwayne sat quiet, embarrassed. Both hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee, like he was trying to warm them. "I'm sorry," he said, not looking up. "Don't know what got into me." "You don't owe me an apology," Jo said, refilling his cup. It sat mostly full already. "Everybody has a hard day sometimes." "Not like that, not grabbing a knife in front of folks." He shook his head, slow. "My wife would have been ashamed of me." "Your wife would have been glad you're still here to be ashamed," Jo said, gently. "That's more than a lot of people get." Dwayne looked up at her, something softening in his face. First time all day. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. He just nodded and went back to his coffee. 20 minutes later, he left. He'd tipped more than the whole meal cost. He slid the bills under his plate, the way men of his generation did when words felt like too much. But Walt Higgins, sitting at his usual stool, hadn't looked away once. He'd seen wrist locks like that before. He'd been trained in that exact motion himself. Decades back, at a police academy 3 counties over. It wasn't something you picked up waitressing at a rough bar. It was something you drilled over and over, until your body did it without your mind thinking it through. He watched Jo help Dwayne sip his water, watched her check his pulse without making a show of it, watched the calm, controlled way she scanned the room after, the way any trained officer scans a room after an incident, checking for threats, checking for injuries, checking that everyone's all right. Walt folded his newspaper slowly and set it down. "Jo," he said, "can I ask you something?" She looked over. "Sure, Walt. That move you just did, where'd you really learn that?" "Same place I learned everything else. On the job." "On the job, waitressing." Walt's voice stayed mild, but his eyes didn't. "That's a real specific way to keep a table for 2 from turning into 3. Folding somebody's wrist like that." For just a flicker of a second, something passed behind Jo's eyes. Not fear exactly. More, the careful recalculation of a person deciding how much truth to give. "Told you," she said, easy smile. "Rough bar." Walt held her gaze a beat longer than comfortable. Then he nodded, slow, like he was filing the answer away without fully believing it. "All right," he said. "All right." He picked his paper back up, but his eyes drifted more than once that afternoon, back to the small silver star pinned to her apron. Grant Hayes heard about the knife incident by early afternoon, the way he heard most things in Millhaven, through the department radio and the regulars who liked to stop by just to chat. He didn't come by the diner again that day, but he made a point of driving past twice slow. His cruiser rolled by the front window like a shark, circling something it hadn't decided to eat. Back at the station in a cramped office, his father sat behind a desk. It had belonged to 3 chiefs before him. Franklin Hayes was 55, broad-shouldered, gray-haired. The kind of face that had learned long ago to look like it was listening, even when it wasn't. "You hear what happened at Rosie's?" Grant asked, dropping into the chair across from him. "Heard something about Dwayne Pratt getting drunk again," Franklin said. He didn't look up from his paperwork. New waitress disarmed him. Some kind of martial arts move. Had the whole diner talking. That got Franklin's attention. He set his pen down. The new one? The blonde girl? Yeah. You had a run-in with her this morning, didn't you? Rosie mentioned something about coffee. Grant shifted in his seat. She spilled it on me. I handled it. You handled it, Franklin repeated, flat. Grant, we've got the ceremony in 5 days. The whole town's watching. The state's sending somebody out to observe the handoff. Make sure everything looks clean before I sign my last order as chief. Last thing I need is you making a scene over coffee and a waitress. It wasn't a scene. Rosie's already talking about it to half the customers who come through her door. That's a scene, son. Grant's jaw tightened. A familiar look. The look of a man who'd spent his whole life being corrected by his father, never quite learning to enjoy it. I'll steer clear of her, he muttered. Good. Keep it that way till after Saturday. Franklin picked his pen back up. We've worked too long to get this department where it is. I'm not letting some new girl's bruised feelings put a wrinkle in it. Grant nodded. But something in the way his father said that needled at him. Worked too long to get this department where it is. He'd heard that phrase before, plenty of times. Always vague. Always followed by a change of subject. The new radios the county couldn't really afford. The tow contract that always went to the same company on Route 9. The department fund that covered things Grant never saw a receipt for. What exactly did we work so hard for, Dad? Grant had asked once, years back. As a teenager, half joking. His father just laughed. Told him he was too young to understand budgets and politics. Grant never asked again. Some part of him had learned, the way kids do, that certain questions stayed unanswered. Asking twice just made things colder around the dinner table. He didn't ask now either. He just nodded, stood, and headed back to his cruiser. The coffee stain on his uniform pants had dried into a dull brown blotch. He hadn't bothered changing out of it. Neither of them noticed, or cared to notice, the state observer Franklin mentioned so casually. Already watching them both 3 days in. From behind a coffee pot and an apron. Closer than either man could imagine. That evening, Walt Higgins didn't head straight home after his usual walk. Instead, he found himself standing in front of a small storage unit, on the edge of town. The kind farmers rented to keep old equipment out of the weather. He hadn't opened this particular unit in almost 2 years. Inside, stacked under a canvas tarp, sat boxes he'd never quite managed to throw away. Old case files copied by hand back before anybody trusted computers with anything important. Photographs, yellowed at the edges. A cracked leather duty belt. Near the bottom of one box sat a small wooden frame. It held a photograph of 2 men in uniform, arms slung over each other's shoulders, laughing at something outside the frame. Walt pulled the photograph out and studied it under a single bare bulb. One of the men was himself, 30 years younger, dark-haired, grinning like he didn't have a worry in the world. The other man was James Whitman, Millhaven's chief of police 20 years back. Before everything happened, before the accident that wasn't really an accident. Though nobody in town ever said that part out loud. Walt had been James Whitman's closest friend on the force. His partner, in every sense of the word. They'd started the academy together. Stood up at each other's weddings. Some years they spent more nights on patrol together than with their own families. When James died, Walt had asked questions. Quiet ones. Careful ones. The kind a man asks when he isn't ready to believe what everyone else accepts. He never got real answers. Just a closed file, a quick funeral, a new chief in the job within the month. Walt told himself back then that pushing harder wouldn't bring his friend back. It would only cost him his own badge. Maybe his pension. Maybe more. So he'd stayed quiet. 20 years of quiet, filed away in a storage unit, along with everything else he couldn't quite let go of. It wasn't something Walt was proud of. Some nights, especially lately, it sat on him heavier than he liked to admit. James Whitman had a daughter. Walt remembered her, barely. A little girl of 4 or 5, blonde hair. She stood at her father's funeral in a dress too big for her. Her fingers laced tight through her mother's knuckles gone pale. Walt hadn't seen that little girl in 20 years. Nobody in town had. The family left Millhaven not long after the funeral. They never came back. He looked at the photograph again, at James Whitman's easy smile, at the star pinned crooked on his chest. He always wore it slightly off-center. Said a straight pin was for men who didn't have anything better to worry about. Walt thought about the way Joe moved that afternoon, disarming Dwayne without raising her voice. About the way she'd said, "Calm as still water, it was my father's." When Grant mocked her pin, he thought about her eyes. Blue, like James Whitman's had been. Steady, in a way that made you trust her, before you had any reason to. "No," Walt said out loud to the empty storage unit. "It can't be." But even as he said it, some old, careful part of him already knew. The part that had spent 31 years reading people for a living. He wrapped the photograph carefully in a soft cloth, slid it into his coat pocket. Then he locked up the storage unit and walked home slower than usual. His mind worked through 20 years of questions he'd never let himself ask out loud. That night, after closing, Joe walked 6 blocks back to her rented room, above the hardware store. The streets sat empty and quiet, streetlights buzzing over cracked sidewalks, the kind of small-town silence that either comforts you or makes your skin crawl. Depends what you're carrying inside. Joe was carrying quite a bit. She locked the door, pulled the blinds shut, and sat on the bed. From her bag, she took out a phone. It looked nothing like the cheap one she used around town. This one was encrypted, state-issued, the kind that never showed up on any bill. Not one Grant Hayes or his father could trace. She dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang twice before a man's voice answered. Low, businesslike. "Ashford, it's me," Joe said, "Captain Whitman." A small pause, almost respectful. "Go ahead." Joe Callahan wasn't her real name. Her real name was Josephine Whitman. Back at the state office 3 hours from Millhaven, they didn't call her a waitress. They called her Captain. "Preliminary contact made with the target," Joe said. "Officer Grant Hayes. Behavior consistent with the complaints on file. Public intimidation, abuse of authority, threats against a local business owner. Anything actionable yet?" "Not yet. He's careless, but he's not stupid. He knows how far he can push before it becomes a real problem for him." Joe glanced toward the window, at the quiet street below. "There's a ceremony in 5 days. Change of command. Chief Hayes is stepping down." "We're aware," Ashford said. "That's your window, Captain. Once that ceremony happens, once the appointment is confirmed, this gets harder. If it's not you standing up there." "What's the current status on the complaint file?" 4 formal complaints against Officer Hayes the last 2 years. Excessive force during a traffic stop. 2 allegations of coercion. 1 complaint withdrawn a week after it was filed. No explanation on record. Ashford's voice went flat, careful, the tone of a man reading off a screen. "That withdrawal is what got my office's attention. Somebody leaned on that complainant, Captain. We just can't prove it yet." "And the older file? My father's case?" A pause on the line. "Longer than the others. Still sealed," Ashford said. "You know I can't reopen a 20-year-old review without new evidence. You find something concrete out there, bring it to me directly. Don't let it become personal in the field." "It's already personal, Director. It's been personal since I was 4 years old." "I know it has." His voice softened, just slightly. "That's exactly why I need you careful. Not fast. Careful. I know. How's the town responding to you so far?" Joe thought about Rosie crouching by the trash can for her father's pin. About Junie, teasing her like they'd known each other for years. About the old man at the counter, watching a little too close. "They're good people," Joe said. "Scared, some of them. But good. And the personal element? You holding up all right?" Everyone at the state office knew Joe's history here, even if nobody in Millhaven did yet. They knew why she'd requested this assignment, over 3 other candidates who could have handled it just as well on paper. "I'm fine," Joe said. "This isn't about me. It's a little bit about you," Ashford said, not unkindly. "Just don't let it cloud the work. We need this done clean. Evidence, testimony, documentation, not emotion. Understood? 5 days, Captain. Call if anything changes." The line went dead. Joe sat there a while, phone resting in her lap. The small silver star lay pinned to the apron, folded over the back of a chair. She reached over and touched it, just for a moment. "I'm close, Dad," she said quietly. "To nobody. I'm real close." Across town that same night, Rosie sat alone in the diner after locking up. She did this most nights now since Dell passed. Just her and the hum of the old refrigerator. A few quiet minutes before heading home to an empty house. She thought about Founders Day, the way she did most years around this time. Dell used to love it. He'd put on his one good suit and walk her down to the square, holding her hand the whole way, like they were still teenagers. He used to say a town that stopped celebrating itself had given up. Rosie wondered what he'd make of this year's ceremony. Franklin Hayes standing up there in his dress uniform, talking about honor and service, while half the town quietly worried what his son might become. Once nobody was left to check him. She hoped, sitting there in the dark, that this year might be different somehow. She couldn't have said why she hoped it. Just a feeling. The same kind Junie's mother always talked about. The kind that settles into a person's bones before the mind catches up. Rosie finally stood, flipped off the last light, and locked the door behind her. Above the diner sign, the old neon flickered once, then steadied, casting its familiar red glow over the empty street. Back in her small room above the hardware store, Jo sat at the narrow desk. A single lamp cast warm light over an old photograph of her own. In it, a man in police uniform held a little girl on his hip, both of them laughing at the camera. A small silver star pinned crooked on his chest. On the back, in handwriting faded but never gone, someone had written a date. 22 years old now. And 3 words. Daddy and Jo. She traced her thumb over the edge of the photo, the same way she did most nights before bed. A small ritual she'd never told anyone about. Not even Ashford. Not even the therapist the department required her to see after she made captain. She remembered a lesson her father gave her once. Before she understood it was a lesson at all. She'd been small, maybe 6, furious at a boy down the street. He'd knocked over her bike on purpose. She wanted to knock his over right back twice as hard. Her father crouched down to her level, still in uniform, smelling like coffee in the outdoors. You can win a fight by being meaner, he told her. Or you can win it by being right and waiting. Meaner is faster. Right takes longer. But right is the only one that holds up the next morning. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now. Every single day she put on that apron. Let Grant Hayes think he'd gotten the better of her. There's a kind of patience that looks like weakness from the outside. People mistake it for that all the time. But patience, real patience, takes more strength than any punch ever could. It means carrying an insult without dropping it on somebody who doesn't deserve the weight. It means trusting the truth, given enough time, finds its own way home. Jo had learned that lesson from her father before she could spell his name. She was still learning it now, a grown woman 20 years later. 5 more days, she whispered. Outside her window, Millhaven slept the way small towns do. Porch lights glowing soft against the dark. The courthouse clock ticking steady toward Saturday. Somewhere across town, in a house with a manicured lawn, Franklin Hayes reviewed his speech, rehearsing words about honor and legacy and 30 years of service. And somewhere else, in a storage unit smelling of dust, sat a photograph, wrapped in cloth, tucked away, waiting for someone brave enough to finally tell the truth. None of them knew yet how close those threads were to coming together. But in 5 days, Millhaven was going to learn something about itself. At a ceremony meant to celebrate one man stepping down. Something about who really deserved to wear a badge in this town. Jo turned off the lamp and lay back on the narrow bed. The photograph rested on her chest, right over her heart, right where her father used to wear his star. Tomorrow, she'd put the apron back on. She'd pour coffee and take orders. She'd let Grant Hayes think whatever he wanted about the quiet new girl. Let him think she was weak. Let him think she was nobody. In 5 days, he'd learn exactly who he'd been mocking all along. Outside, the wind picked up a little, rattling the old shutters above the hardware store. Down the block, the courthouse clock struck 10, slow and steady, the way it struck every hour, for as long as anyone in Millhaven could remember. Some towns keep their secrets buried so deep, nobody thinks to dig anymore. Millhaven had been keeping one for 20 years. But secrets, like coffee left too long on the burner, turn bitter before anyone's ready to taste them. And in 5 days, this whole town was going to get a taste. One it wouldn't forget. There is a particular kind of courage that never makes the evening news. It doesn't look like much from the outside. It looks like an old man folding his newspaper slow, choosing not to press a question before he's certain. It looks like a widow keeping her diner open past dark, just so a stranger has somewhere warm to stand. It looks like a young woman pouring coffee for a man who just humiliated her. Hands steady, voice level, giving nothing away. That kind of courage doesn't announce itself. It just keeps showing up, morning after morning, waiting for the day it's finally needed. It doesn't ask for thanks. It doesn't expect to be noticed. Most days, nobody notices it at all. Millhaven had no idea how much of it was already sitting in that diner. Disguised as ordinary people living ordinary lives, pouring coffee, reading newspapers, waiting on suspects who never came. It was about to find out what that quiet courage could do. Once it finally ran out of patience. Wednesday came to Millhaven the way it always did. Quiet. Gray. A little too early. But something in the air over Rosie's diner had shifted since Tuesday. People still came in for coffee. They just watched a little closer now. Jo tied her apron on before sunrise. The small silver star sat pinned crooked at her chest, right where it belonged. She poured coffee. She took orders. She smiled at Mildred Vance, who nodded back like they shared a secret now. 4 days left until Saturday. 4 days until the whole town gathered in the square. One Hayes stepping down. Maybe the town handing its future to the other one. Jo hadn't forgotten that. Neither had Grant. He didn't come by the diner that morning. His father's warning had landed harder than Grant let on. But warnings only hold a man like Grant for so long. Everyone in Millhaven would learn that soon enough. Around 10 o'clock, the bell over the door rang. A different kind of trouble walked in. Marla Doyle ran the county health office. She'd been coming to Rosie's for lunch twice a week. For a decade now. Always friendly. Always tipping fair. Today she didn't sit down. She stood at the counter with a clipboard. She looked apologetic before she even opened her mouth. "Rosie, I'm sorry about this," Marla said. "Got a call this morning, anonymous complaint about the walk-in cooler." Rosie's face went still. "What kind of complaint?" "Temperature irregularities. I have to check it. Regulations. There's nothing wrong with that cooler, Marla. You checked it in March." "I know. I'm sorry." Marla lowered her voice. "The call came from the station line. I'm not saying who. I'm just saying where." Rosie's jaw tightened, but she nodded and led Marla back toward the kitchen. Jo watched them go. She understood exactly what had just happened, even if nobody said Grant Hayes out loud. The inspection took 20 minutes. The cooler passed, of course. There had never been anything wrong with it. Marla apologized twice more on her way out, clearly uncomfortable with the whole errand. But the message had been sent anyway, loud and clear, the way messages like that always are in a small town. Dwayne Pratt watched the whole thing from his stool at the counter. He hadn't said a word through any of it, but once Marla's car pulled away, he set down his coffee, quiet and firm. "That wasn't about the cooler," Dwayne said. Nobody had asked him. He said it anyway. Pete Larson, 2 stools down, folded his newspaper. "Wasn't about the cooler at all." Neither man said Grant's name. They didn't need to. In Millhaven, some things got said just by what didn't get said out loud. Rosie leaned against the counter after Marla left, arms crossed, staring at nothing in particular. "He can't shut me down over a made-up complaint," she said. "Can he?" "He can waste your time and your nerves trying," Jo said. "That's usually the point, not winning, wearing you down." "Well, it's working," Rosie muttered. Then softer, "I'm not firing you, Jo. In case that's what this is about. I never thought you would." "Good, because I meant what I said the other day. You remind me of somebody good." Rosie shook her head, like she was chasing off a thought she couldn't quite name. "Can't tell you who. Just a feeling." Jo said nothing to that, but something in her chest tightened all the same. By mid-morning, word of the health inspection had already made its way around the counter. Nobody said much about it out loud, but Pete left an extra $1 under his mug on his way out. Dwayne came back twice for refills he didn't need, just to sit a while longer near the register. Small gestures, none of them worth remarking on by themselves. Together, they added up to something Rosie noticed and never once mentioned. Across town, at a storage unit smelling of dust, Walt Higgins sat, on an overturned crate. A case file lay open across his knees. He'd come back twice since Tuesday night. Each time he told himself he was just tidying up, sorting things he should have thrown out years ago. Each time he ended up here instead, reading the same 20-year-old pages until the light went dim. Something had bothered him since he watched Jo disarm Dwayne Pratt. It sat under his ribs like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. So Wednesday morning, before the diner even opened, Walt pulled the accident report out again. He read it slower than he ever had before. James Whitman, age 38. Single vehicle accident, County Road 9, 11:40 at night. Road conditions listed as icy. Cause of death, blunt force trauma. A high-speed collision with the guardrail near Miller's Creek Bridge. Walt had read those words 100 times over the years. He'd always let his eyes slide past the bottom corner, the small box where the responding officer signed his name. This time, he didn't let his eyes slide past it. Officer F. Hayes. Walt sat very still. He remembered Franklin Hayes younger then, eager, ambitious, ready to please men who outranked him. Walt had never thought twice about an officer signing a routine report. Officers signed plenty of routine reports. It hadn't seemed like anything at all. But it wasn't routine. Not that report. Not that road. Walt closed his eyes a moment, letting himself remember. James Whitman used to whistle off key on morning patrol. Some old tune he never got quite right. He kept a photo of his baby daughter taped inside his ticket book, worn soft from being handsold so much. He gave half his lunch away to anyone who looked hungrier. Every single time, without fail. He'd been the best man Walt ever served beside. Not the toughest. Not the loudest. Just the most honest, in a job that tested a man's honesty every single day. Walt opened his eyes again. Back in the storage unit. Dust motes drifted through the single shaft of light. Walt had driven County Road 9 1,000 times. That stretch near Miller's Creek Bridge didn't ice over easy. It ran along a ridge that caught the wind, dried faster than any other road in the county. He remembered that specifically. He and James used to joke about it, back when they rode patrol together on cold mornings. James used to say that Bridge was the one honest patch of road, the one place that never lied to you about the weather. Walt flipped to the next page, a weather report, pulled from the county almanac, stapled to the file. Overnight low of 34 degrees. Above freezing. No ice advisory issued that night anywhere in the county. His hands weren't quite steady as he set the page down. He'd asked questions back then. He remembered asking them. He remembered the chief at the time, a heavy-set man named Otis Reed, sitting him down, telling him gently but firmly to let it go. Grief does strange things to a man's judgment, Otis had said. Best to let James rest and let the department heal. Walt had let it go. 20 years of letting it go. He looked at the young officer's signature again. F. Hayes. Franklin Hayes had been the one who rode up that road as icy, the one who signed off on an explanation that never matched the weather that night. It didn't prove anything, not by itself. A tired officer could make an honest mistake on a report. Walt knew that. He'd made mistakes himself, plenty of them, over 31 years. But it was a thread. Once you found the first thread on something like this, you kept pulling. Walt knew that from long experience. You didn't stop until you found where it led. He thought about waiting, about handing this to someone else, someone still wearing a badge, someone with standing to open an official file. But every name that came to mind led back to Franklin, one way or another. 15 years running this department left a man's fingerprints on more than he'd admit to. No, Walt decided. If this was going anywhere, it would have to go through him first. Quiet. Careful. Same as he'd handled everything worth handling across 31 years on this job. He just needed to know when to move, and when to keep his own counsel a little longer. Thursday morning, Walt drove to the county library. A squat brick building, 2 blocks off the square. Barely changed since Walt was a boy. Inside, the air smelled like old paper and radiator heat. Behind the front desk sat Evelyn Combs. She'd run this library for almost 30 years. She remembered every face that walked through the door. Walt Higgins, Evelyn said, looking up over her glasses. Don't see you in here twice in 1 decade, let alone twice in 1 week. Needed to check something in the old papers, Evelyn. Something from about 20 years back. Evelyn's smile faded slightly, curious now. What kind of something? An accident. County Road 9. Winter 20 years ago this coming January. She didn't ask why. Evelyn had lived in Millhaven long enough. She knew when a question deserved privacy instead of chatter. She led him to the microfilm machine in the back corner. She pulled a spool labeled with the right year. Then she left him alone with it. It took him almost an hour to find the article. A short one tucked on page 4 of the Millhaven Gazette. The headline read, "Local officer killed in weather-related crash." Walt read it twice. The article matched the official report almost word for word. Icy conditions. A tragic loss for the department. A young officer quoted anonymously, praising the department's swift and thorough investigation. Walt leaned back in his chair, the old machine humming under his hands. Evelyn came by a while later. She carried 2 cups of coffee from the break room machine. She set one down next to him without being asked. You look like a man who found something he didn't want to find, she said. Maybe I did. You want to talk about it? Not yet. Walt wrapped his hands around the warm cup. Maybe soon, Evelyn. Maybe real soon. She nodded, not pushing further. That was the thing about Evelyn Combs. 30 years behind that desk had taught her something. When to ask and when to simply sit with a person a while. Whatever it is, she said, you know where to find me. I do. Thank you. He sat with the microfilm a while longer, alone now. The machines hummed, the only sound in the quiet building. 20 years, and this town had let the whole thing close in 2 weeks flat. 20 years, and Walt himself had let it close right along with it. That part stung worse than anything printed on the page. He thought about all the mornings since then. Coffee with men who'd shaken Franklin Hayes's hand at ribbon cuttings. Handshakes at the diner counter, at church, at the hardware store. None of them knowing what Walt was starting to suspect. None of them able to know. Because Walt himself had stayed quiet long enough to let the town forget there was ever anything to ask about. A swift investigation. That detail stuck now, 20 years later, in a way it never had before. Most fatal accidents involving an officer got reviewed for months. James Whitman's case had closed inside of 2 weeks. 2 weeks. And an officer's signature on a weather report that didn't match the sky that night. Walt thought about the little girl he'd seen at the funeral. Small hands gripping her mother's like she'd never let go. He thought about the woman behind the counter at Rosie's diner. Steady-eyed, calm under pressure, wearing her father's star pinned crooked on her chest. He didn't have proof yet. Not real proof, the kind that would hold up anywhere that mattered. But he had a thread now and a name at the end of it. And 20 years of guilt telling him it was long past time to pull. On his way home, Walt stopped by the diner for a slice of pie. Though pie wasn't really what he'd come for. You've got that look, Rosie said, sliding a plate across the counter. The one my Dell used to get, right before he'd tell me something I didn't want to hear. Maybe I do. Well, spit it out, Walt. I've known you 30 years. You've never once been a coward about anything. Walt turned his fork over in his hands, choosing his words careful. Rosie, if I told you Joe might be somebody's daughter, somebody this town wronged a long time ago, would you believe me? Rosie went very still. Whose daughter, Walt? Not yet, he said. I need to be sure first, but when I am, I might need your help keeping her safe. You already know the answer to that, Rosie said quietly. Whatever she needs, this diner's got it. Walt nodded, grateful, and finished his pie in silence. Joe found Walt sitting alone in his usual booth that Thursday afternoon. The lunch rush already come and gone. His coffee had gone cold in front of him. He hadn't touched his toast. You all right, Walt? She asked, refilling his cup out of habit. He looked up at her a long moment before answering. Can I ask you something, Joe? I'd appreciate a straight answer if you've got one in you. Depends on the question. Your father. What was his name? The coffee pot in Joe's hand stayed steady, but something behind her eyes went very still. Why do you ask? Because I think I might have known him, Walt said quietly, a long time ago. And I think something happened to him this town never got straight about. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The diner hummed around them, forks and low conversation, completely unaware of the waits sitting at that one booth. Joe set the coffee pot down. Walt, I can't talk about this right now, she said. Not here. Not yet. That's not a no. It's not a yes either. She met his eyes, steady, careful. Give me a little more time, please. Walt studied her a long moment, then nodded slow. All right. I've waited 20 years already. I suppose I can wait a few more days. He paused, half rising from the booth, then sat back down. Can I tell you one thing before you walk off? Whatever you're carrying, whoever you turn out to be, you've done good work in this town this week. That's true, no matter what else is true. That means more than you know, Walt. I mean it plain. Not many folks your age would have handled Grant Hayes the way you did. Not many folks my age either. Come to that. Thank you, Joe said quietly. She meant it more than he could know. Ashford's voice echoed in her head from every call they'd had. Evidence. Testimony. Documentation. Not emotion. She couldn't afford for this to unravel sideways. Not 4 days before the ceremony. Not with an old man's grief tangled up in it, however well meant. But some small, unguarded part of her wanted to sit down in that booth, to tell Walt Higgins everything. Wanted it badly, she didn't. Not yet. She just squeezed his shoulder once, gently, and went back to work. Across the diner, Rosie watched the two of them from behind the register. pretending to count receipts. She had never once seen Walt look at a person like that. Not suspicion exactly. Something closer to recognition and grief and a strange, careful hope all tangled together. Rosie didn't know what it meant yet, but she filed it away, the same patient way she filed away most things worth remembering in this town. That night, Joe made her call to Ashford, same narrow room above the hardware store. Same encrypted phone pressed to her ear. "There's a complication," she said. "A local man, Walter Higgins, retired officer. He was my father's partner 20 years ago. He's starting to put pieces together on his own." "Is that a problem for us or a help?" Ashford asked. "I don't know yet. He's careful, trained, hasn't said anything to anyone else, far as I know." Joe paused. "He asked me directly today if I was James Whitman's daughter." "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I asked for time." Ashford was quiet a moment. "Use him if you can, Captain. A retired officer with institutional memory could be worth more than you think, once this moves into daylight. But keep him contained until it does. One loose thread pulled too early unravels the whole coat." "Understood. Anything else?" Joe hesitated. "Officer Hayes had the county health inspector sent to the diner today. Bogus complaint, traced back to the station line. Pure intimidation. Document it. Time, date, the inspector's name if you have it." "Already have." "One more thing, Captain. Assuming the ceremony proceeds as scheduled, we'll have a small team positioned nearby Saturday morning. Standard procedure for a change of command with an active review attached. They'll stay out of sight unless you call for them." "Understood." "Good work, Captain." 3 days. The line went dead. Joe sat there a moment in the dark, the small silver star still pinned to the apron, folded over her chair. She thought about Walt's question, the way his voice had gone soft and careful around the edges when he asked it. "Your father, what was his name?" 3 more days, she told herself. Just 3 more days. Justice, her father used to say, rarely arrives on schedule. It arrives when the truth is finally ready to be believed. A person could spend a lifetime waiting on that readiness. Joe had learned, from watching him, that the waiting itself was not wasted time. It was the work. Quiet, unglamorous, necessary work. She didn't sleep well that night, but she didn't expect to. Thursday afternoon, before the dinner rush, Mildred Vance lingered at the counter longer than usual. Joe noticed and came over, refilling her coffee without being asked. "You've got somewhere to be, Mrs. Vance?" "Not really. Just didn't feel like going home to an empty house today." Mildred wrapped both hands around her cup. "My husband used to say the diner counter was the closest thing to a church. People confess things here they'd never say anywhere else. He sounds like he understood people pretty well. He did. 31 years wearing a badge. He never once raised his voice at a soul who didn't deserve it." Mildred's eyes went distant, somewhere back in time. "Officers like that used to be the rule around here, not the exception. I don't know when that changed exactly. Somewhere along the way, it did." "I'm sorry," Joe said softly. "Don't be sorry, be like him." Mildred patted her hand once, brief and warm. "You already are, near as I can tell." Joe didn't trust her voice enough to answer that. She just squeezed the old woman's hand back, then went to check on her other tables. Grant Hayes spent Thursday evening running patrol on the edge of town, restless, unable to sit still with the ceremony bearing down on him. He picked up Junie Sullivan's car on Route 9. A little after 9, right after she left her shift. Nothing wrong with the car. He knew that before he even hit the lights. But he pulled her over anyway. Slow, deliberate. Watching her knuckles go white on the wheel in his rearview mirror, Junie rolled her window down, trying to keep her voice steady. "Evening, officer. Something wrong?" "Taillights out. Both my taillights work fine. One's dimmer than the other. I noticed it 3 blocks back." Grant leaned toward her window, unhurried. "License and registration." Junie handed them over, hands shaking slightly now. Grant took his time, flipping through pages he didn't need to flip through, letting the silence stretch out. "You're friendly with the new girl at the diner," he said finally, not looking up. "Joe. She's my co-worker. Cowworkers talk. What's she been saying about me?" "Nothing, officer. We just work together." Grant studied her a moment longer, then handed her license back, along with a citation slip. "Faulty equipment. Fix that taillight by Monday, or it's a fine." "There's nothing wrong with my taillight." "There is now." He tapped the citation once against her window frame. "You seem like a nice girl, Junie. I'd hate for something small like this to turn into something bigger." Understand me? Junie didn't answer. She just nodded, throat tight. She watched him walk back to his cruiser, slow, satisfied. She didn't cry until he pulled away. Then she sat on the shoulder of Route 9 a long 5 minutes, hands still shaking, before she trusted herself to drive. Word reached Joe within the hour. Junie called Rosie in tears from her apartment. Rosie called Joe before she'd even hung up the phone. Joe found Junie at her small rented place above the laundromat 20 minutes later, still shaken, a citation slip crumpled on her kitchen table. He didn't hurt me, Junie said quickly before Joe could ask. He just scared me. Bad. Show me the citation. Junie handed it over. Joe scanned it once. Her jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Faulty equipment, Section 4-12. Joe read aloud. Did he cite a specific taillight? Left or right? He just said dimmer than the other one. That's not a valid citation on its own. State code requires the officer to note the specific malfunction and its location. Joe set the paper down. This wasn't about your taillight, Junie. You know that. I know. Junie's voice cracked. He asked about you. What you've been saying about him. Something cold moved behind Joe's eyes. Control. Careful, but unmistakable. I'm sorry he did this to you. It's not your fault. It's not yours either. Joe sat down across from her. Listen to me. You did nothing wrong tonight. Not one thing. A man with a badge decided to scare a young woman. Because he's afraid of something he can't control. That's on him. Every bit of it. Junie wiped her eyes, managing a small, unsteady laugh. You always talk like this? Like you memorized it from a book somewhere? Something like that, Joe said quietly. Junie was quiet a moment, tracing the rim of her water glass. Can I ask you something? Why do you even care this much? You've only known me a week. Doesn't take longer than a week to see somebody's got a good heart, Junie. I saw it your first shift. The way you talk to Mrs. Vance. Way you cover for the cook when he's slow, without making him feel small about it. Joe shrugged. People who look out for others deserve somebody looking out for them too. That's all. Junie's eyes filled again, but different this time. Stia dear, nobody's really said something like that to me before. Somebody should have, a long time ago. She stayed another 20 minutes until Junie's hands stopped shaking. Then she walked home slow through the dark, past the courthouse, past the diner's dim neon glow, turning the citation over and over in her mind. Grant Hayes had made a mistake tonight. Not the taillight, and not the intimidation, though those were mistakes enough. He'd made the mistake of putting his name on a piece of paper again. In a town where paper had a way of outliving the men who signed it, he drove home slow that night. A longer route than usual, past the old grain elevator. He didn't examine why. If he'd let himself think about it too directly, he might have admitted the truth. Easier to just drive, radio off, until the feeling passed. It didn't pass. Not fully. It just went quiet, the way most things did in Grant's life, waiting for the next excuse to come back louder. By Friday morning, word of the traffic stop had already made its way around town. Pete Larson heard it first from another trucker at the fuel stop. The man had seen Junie's car parked on the shoulder the night before. By the time Pete reached the diner, he'd heard 3 different versions of the story, each one worse than the last. That boy's getting reckless, Pete said to Dwayne, sliding onto his usual stool. Used to just be rude. Now he's out there scaring young women on empty roads at night. Won't be long till somebody stands up to him proper, Dwayne said. Man like that always pushes till somebody does. Neither of them knew how soon that reckoning would come. Friday morning, Grant sat across from his father's desk again, jaw set, refusing to meet Franklin's eyes. Heard you pulled the Sullivan girl over last night, Franklin said. He didn't look up from his coffee. Faulty taillight. Her taillights work fine, Grant. I checked the report myself. Franklin finally looked up. You want to explain what you were actually doing out there? Making sure people understand where the line is. The line. Franklin set his mug down hard, coffee sloshing over the rim. The ceremony is tomorrow. The state's watching everything we do this week. You decide now is the time to harass a waitress on an empty road. She's spreading rumors about me. Her and that new girl both. So handle it quietly, Franklin snapped. Not with a bogus citation any lawyer could tear apart in 10 minutes. Grant's jaw tightened. What am I supposed to do? Let them talk? Franklin studied his son a long moment, something calculating settling behind his eyes. There's a difference between letting something go and handling it smart, he said. Voice lower now. You want this new girl to stop being a problem. You don't harass her friends. Not where anybody could see. You find something real, something that sticks, something nobody argues with. He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. Grant sat there a moment, turning his father's words over, something ugly and eager taking shape behind his eyes. I hear you, Grant said finally. Good. Because tomorrow, this department needs to look clean. Whatever you do between now and then, it needs to look clean too. Franklin picked his pen back up, already moving to the next item on his desk. Don't embarrass this family again, son. Not this close to Saturday. Grant left the office with something new sitting in his chest. Not caution, not restraint, an idea. Alone in his office, Franklin sat for a long while after his son left, staring at nothing in particular. Something uneasy moved through him, faint and familiar, a feeling he'd gotten skilled at pushing down over the years. He told himself Grant just needed guidance. Every young officer did. He told himself the department's reputation mattered more than one waitress's bruised feelings, whoever she turned out to be. He did not let himself think about a rainy night on County Road 9, a long time ago. He had gotten very good over 20 years at not thinking about that night directly. It was easier that way. It had always been easier that way. Franklin picked up his ceremony speech and read it over one more time, searching for the right words about honor and service. He did not notice how hollow they had started to sound in his own mouth. That same Friday morning, Rosie sat alone in her diner before opening, thinking about Junie's shaking hands the night before, thinking about Marla Doyle's apologetic clipboard, thinking about a man with a badge, determined to squeeze this town until something broke. She thought about Dell, too, what he would have told her to do. Dell had never been a brave man in any loud way, but he'd had a quiet kind of courage, the sort that didn't announce itself. He would have told her to keep the coffee hot, the doors open, her spine straight. He would have told her that backing down from a bully never once stopped it. Rosie stood and flipped the sign on the door to open. She decided, quietly and firmly, that she was not backing down. Not from Grant Hayes, not from anybody. The Founders Day fun jar sat on the counter at Rosie's diner, same as it had every October for 11 years. A simple mason jar, a paper label reading Founders Day decorations. Regulars dropped their spare change in it, sometimes a folded bill, to help cover bunting, folding chairs, and the little brass band, the one that played every year from the courthouse steps. By Friday afternoon, the jar held just over $400. Rosie counted it every few days, mostly out of habit. Always left it out in plain sight. That was how things worked in Millhaven. You trusted your neighbors with a coffee can full of cash. For a very long time, that trust had never once been misplaced. Grant Hayes had walked past that jar 100 times without a second glance. Friday afternoon, he looked at it differently. Sitting alone in his cruiser, parked outside the diner, Grant's stomach twisted. He told himself this was smart. His father's words, not his own. Find something real, something that sticks. He told himself Jo had brought this on herself, mouthing off that first morning, embarrassing him in front of half the town. He almost talked himself out of it twice. Both times he thought of his father's face, the disappointment in it, the way it always seemed to be waiting for Grant to fail. That thought settled it more than anything else could have. He got out of the cruiser and straightened his jacket, then walked inside wearing his easiest smile. He came into the diner a little after 2, quiet, almost pleasant. He ordered a coffee to go. Made easy conversation with Rosie about the ceremony setup. Jo was in the back, helping the cook restock supplies. Junie was on break. For about 90 seconds, the front of the diner sat empty, except for Grant and that jar. Nobody saw exactly what happened in those 90 seconds. That was rather the point. By the time Jo came back out front, Grant had already paid and gone, waving pleasantly to Rosie on his way out. The picture of a friendly small-town officer, stopping by for his afternoon cup. Nobody thought anything of it. Not that day. Outside, the town square kept filling in with color. Workers hung the last of the bunting along the courthouse steps. Somebody tested the old sound system. A burst of feedback echoed down Main Street. It settled into a scratchy recording of a marching band. Neighbors stopped to chat on benches nearby, remembering other Founders Days, other years, other versions of this same small-town square. Millhaven had held this ceremony every year for as long as anyone could remember. It had survived hard winters and harder decades. Tomorrow it would survive one more test, though nobody preparing those folding chairs yet knew what kind. Friday evening, just before closing, two cruisers pulled up outside Rosie's diner. Lights off, engines idling low in the dusk. Grant walked in first. Behind him came a younger officer Joe hadn't seen much of, a nervous rookie named Dale Whitfield, eyes mostly on the floor. The dinner crowd, thin but present, went quiet almost instantly. Walt Higgins sat in his booth over a late cup of coffee. He set his mug down. Slow. "Evening, folks," Grant said, voice pitched loud for the whole room. "Sorry to interrupt. We received a report this afternoon. Missing funds from a charitable collection jar. Specifically, the Founders Day fund kept on this counter." Rosie's face went pale. "Missing? Grant, that jar's been sitting right there all day. Report says it's short. Considerably short." Grant's eyes moved toward the back of the diner, toward Joe, who stood very still by the kitchen door. "Given the timing, and certain concerns already raised, we need to search personal belongings." "You cannot be serious," Rosie said. "Dead serious, ma'am. I've got a signed complaint and probable cause." Grant nodded toward Dale, who produced a folded paper, hands not quite steady. "This won't take long if everyone cooperates." Dale Whitfield had been on the force 8 months. Long enough to know a real investigation from a rushed one. This felt rushed. It felt wrong in a way he couldn't quite name out loud. Not to a superior officer, not with a new mortgage, and a career still finding its footing. So he stood there instead, silent, doing as he was told, hating himself a little more with every passing second. Joe didn't move. She didn't argue. She stood there, calm, watching Grant Hayes. The same way she'd watched him that very first morning, when he threw her father's star into the trash and called it a joke. "Search whatever you need to," she said quietly. "I've got nothing to hide." That calm seemed to bother Grant more than any protest could have. He walked past her toward the small employee area near the kitchen. Bags and coats hung on a row of hooks. He found Joe's bag easily. He'd known exactly where to look. He unzipped it slowly, in full view of the room, and reached inside. He pulled out a folded stack of bills, rubber banded together, tucked beneath a spare apron. Marked bills, Joe would later learn. Die-packed and photocopied ahead of time by whoever had planted them there. "Well," Grant said, holding the stack up for the room to see. Something close to triumph flickered across his face. "That's an awful lot of cash for a waitress carrying a spare apron." The diner went completely silent. Rosie's mouth opened, then closed, no words coming out at all. Junie, just arriving for the evening shift, froze in the doorway. Keys still in her hand, Mildred Vance set down her fork, her old eyes wide with something between disbelief and fury. Walt Higgins rose slowly from his booth. Every instinct from 31 years of training screamed something. Something here was deeply, deliberately wrong. "That's not mine," Joe said. Still calm, still steady, but something in her voice had sharpened now. "I've never seen that money before in my life." "Funny," Grant said. "It was in your bag. Anyone could have put it there." "Sure they could." Grant's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Turn around, please." "Grant, this is insane," Rosie said, finding her voice at last. "This girl has done nothing but good work since the day she walked in here. I understand this is upsetting, ma'am, but the law doesn't care how good someone seems." Grant's hand moved to the cuffs on his belt. "Turn around." Joe held his gaze one more moment, long enough that something passed between them. Something Grant couldn't quite read, something that looked almost like pity. Then she turned around, hands behind her back, calm as still water, exactly the way her father had taught her all those years ago. In a lesson she was only now fully understanding. The cuffs clicked shut. "You've got the right to remain silent," Grant said, reciting the words with obvious relish. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Walt Higgins took one step forward, then stopped himself. Jaw tight, some old and careful instinct held him back. He had a thread and a name, and 20 years of guilt telling him this wasn't the moment to pull it. Not yet, not with half of it still unproven. Instead, as the young officer gathered up Joe's things, her apron, her bag, the small silver star still pinned to the strap, Walt caught his eye. "Son," Walt said quietly, "you make sure every one of her belongings gets logged proper. Every item. You understand me?" Dale glanced at Grant, uncertain, then nodded to Walt instead. "Yes, sir, every item." It was a small thing, a retired officer's quiet request to a nervous rookie, nothing more. But Walt Higgins had spent 31 years learning something. Small things, logged proper, had a way of mattering. 20 years down the line, sometimes, they walked Joe out through the front door of Rosie's diner in handcuffs. Past the counter where she'd poured 1,000 cups of coffee that week. Past the booth where Mildred Vance sat, hand pressed to her mouth. Past the trash can where this whole story had started, 3 days earlier, with a spilled cup of coffee and a mocked, discarded pin. Outside, the last light was fading over Main Street. The Founders' Day bunting fluttered gently along the courthouse railing, red, white, and blue, ready for a celebration that suddenly felt very far away. Grant guided her into the back of his cruiser, one hand firm on her shoulder, careful not to bump her head, following procedure even now, even here. Some part of him still performing decency for the small crowd on the sidewalk. "Enjoy your night," he said quietly, just for her, as he shut the door. Joe looked up at him through the window, calm, unshaken. Something in her eyes that Grant would replay later that night, not fully understanding it until it was far too late to matter. "I intend to," she said. The cruiser pulled away from the curb. It carried the quiet new girl from Rosie's diner toward a jail cell, one she'd never once, in 3 days of careful, patient waiting, expected to occupy. Behind her, the town stood in the street, stunned into silence, watching taillights disappear around the corner by the courthouse. Rosie was the first to move. She wrapped an arm around Junie, who'd started crying again. Quiet this time, more out of anger than fear. Mildred Vance rose slowly from her booth and walked to the door. She stood there a long moment, staring out at the empty street, like she was memorizing it. That girl, Mildred said, to no one in particular, did not steal one thin dime. Nobody argued with her. Not one person in that diner. Dwayne Pratt sat frozen on his stool, his coffee gone cold and forgotten. He was the one who'd nearly cut somebody with a kitchen knife, drunk and unsteady. Joe had calmed him without a hint of judgment in her voice. He remembered her exact words afterward. Gentle, patient, treating him like a man worth saving. Not a problem to be managed. He thought about that now, watching the cruiser's taillights fade around the corner. "That girl helped me," Dwayne said quietly, mostly to himself. "Helped me and never once made me feel small about needing it." Nobody answered him either. Nobody needed to. The whole diner understood exactly what he meant. Walt stood apart from the rest, hands in his coat pockets, turning something over in his mind that felt heavier by the minute. He had a name at the end of a 20-year-old thread, and a young woman in a jail cell who deserved better than his caution. He thought about the years he'd spent waiting for a reason good enough to act. He'd told himself he was being careful. Some nights, lying awake, he'd wondered if he was only being afraid. Tonight, watching those taillights disappear, the difference stopped mattering. He'd made his decision 3 days ago. That first evening he stood in that storage unit. He just hadn't said it out loud until now. Whatever came next, he was going to be standing in that square on Saturday, ready to move the moment the truth needed a hand to carry it. Tomorrow was Founders' Day. Tomorrow Franklin Hayes would stand on that little wooden stage, talking about honor and legacy and 30 years of service. Walt intended to be standing in that crowd when he did. There is a particular kind of waiting that tests a person more than any fight. It asks nothing of the body. It asks everything of the will. It asks a person to sit still while injustice walks free. To trust that patience is not the same thing as surrender. Joe had been taught that lesson her whole life, without ever wanting to learn it. Walt was learning it late, 20 years late, in a storage unit full of dust and old regret. Even Rosie and Mildred and Junie were learning some version of it now. Standing together in a diner gone quiet, refusing to let fear have the last word. Tomorrow, Millhaven would gather in its square, the way it had every October for longer than anyone could remember. Bunting would flutter. A band would play, slightly off-key, the way it always did. And somewhere beneath all that familiar celebration, the truth would finally get its chance. To stand up too. A man could spend 20 years believing his silence was mercy, believing he was protecting a grieving town from a wound better left closed. It took something like tonight to show him the difference. Cuffs closing on the wrong wrist. Mercy and cowardice rarely look the same. Not from the inside, not from 20 years down the road. Walt Higgins had made peace with a great many things in his life. He had never quite made peace with this one. Tomorrow, at last, he intended to. And somewhere in a jail cell, 3 blocks off the square, A woman sat still. Josephine Whitman, hands folded in her lap, waiting the way she'd been trained to wait, for the exact right moment to finally stand up. Saturday morning came to Millhaven gray and still. The county jail sat 3 blocks off the square, a squat brick building. Nobody paid it much attention most days. Today it held the one thing this town couldn't stop talking about. Jo sat on the thin mattress of her holding cell, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She hadn't slept much, she hadn't expected to. She thought about her father the way she always did in quiet moments. He'd sat in rooms like this himself, she imagined, waiting on suspects, waiting on justice, waiting on a system that moved slower than anyone wanted. Waiting had never been the hard part for James Whitman. Trusting the waiting would matter, that had always been harder. He used to tell her, back when she was too small to understand, a badge alone didn't make a person good. It just gave a person more chances to prove whether they already were. She hadn't understood that either, not then. She understood it now, sitting in a cell, wearing someone else's version of who she was supposed to be. Down the hall, a deputy's radio crackled with morning traffic. Somewhere outside, church bells rang for the early service. Millhaven was waking up the same way it always did, unaware that everything about to unfold that day would change how this town saw itself. Jo thought about the 7 days behind her, the coffee spilled on purpose, the pin thrown in the trash, Dwayne's shaking hands around a knife he never meant to raise, Junie crying on the shoulder of an empty road, Walt's careful, patient questions, circling closer to the truth every single day. None of it had gone the way training manuals described. Real work rarely did. Her instructors back at the academy liked to say undercover work was 90% waiting, 10% everything happening at once. She was beginning to understand exactly what they meant. She thought about her mother too, briefly, the way she rarely allowed herself to. Her mother had handed her that pin the week she made captain, said only that her father would have wanted her to have it, said that someday, if she ever needed the truth, it would be there. Her mother had died without ever fully explaining what she meant. Jo had spent years assuming it was simply sentiment, grief, wrapped in metal. She wondered now, sitting in a cell, whether her mother had known more. Her mother had never once spoken badly of Millhaven, even at the end, even knowing what this town had cost her, cost both of them. She used to say bitterness was a debt that only ever collected interest, better to let it go unpaid. Jo had inherited a great many things from her parents. That particular kind of restraint sat heaviest of all. Jo closed her eyes and waited. Word of the arrest had spread through Millhaven fast. By the time the diner opened Saturday morning, everyone in town had an opinion. Never trusted her, said a man named Carl Osgood. He slid onto a stool he rarely used. Too calm for a person with nothing to hide, if you ask me. Rosie set his coffee down harder than necessary. Nobody asked you, Carl. Just saying what folks are thinking. Then folks can think it somewhere else. Not in my diner. Rosie's voice had an edge. Nobody had heard from her in years. That girl has done nothing but good work here. I don't care what Grant Hayes claims he found. Carl raised his hands, surrendering the point. He said nothing more. But he wasn't the only one whispering that morning. By 8 o'clock, half the regulars had cycled through. Some version of the same doubt, same careful distance, same unwillingness to fully believe in a stranger. Mildred Vance sat in her usual booth, arms crossed. She glared at anyone who repeated the rumor within earshot. Junie moved through her shift red-eyed and silent, snapping at nobody but clearly ready to. Dwayne Pratt took to sitting at the counter like a sentry, daring anyone to say a word against the woman who'd once talked him down. Nothing but patience. Rosie watched her diner divide itself quietly into 2 camps. Those who still believed. Those who'd already decided. She hated how easily the second camp had formed. Pete Larson came in not long after, still in his work boots. He'd heard the news secondhand from a fuel stop attendant 20 miles out. He listened to Carl's version of events without comment. Then he set his coffee down and shook his head slowly. "You all forgetting something," Pete said to the counter in general. "That girl handled Grant Hayes better than this town managed in years. Man like that doesn't get embarrassed without deciding somebody's going to pay for it." Nobody argued with him directly, but nobody agreed out loud either, not yet. Pete drank his coffee in a silence that felt heavier than words would have. At the far end of the counter, an empty stool sat, the one Walt Higgins usually took. Rosie kept glancing at it between orders. Some mornings, a person's absence said more than their presence ever could. Walt Higgins arrived at the county station a little after 8. He wore his good coat, the one he saved for funerals and court dates. He hadn't been inside this building in years, not since he turned in his own badge. But the front desk sergeant still recognized him on sight. "Walt Higgins. Didn't expect to see you in here." "Wasn't expecting to be here, Carl." Walt paused. "Different Carl. Not the one at the diner." The sergeant laughed, though it faded once Walt explained what he wanted. "I need to see the property log from last night's arrest. The Joe Callahan matter." "That's an active case, Walt. You know I can't just hand that over." "I'm not asking for the case file, just her personal effects. There's a keepsake in there. Small silver pin belonged to her father. Nothing to do with the charges." Walt kept his voice even, patient. A man who'd spent 31 years learning how to ask without demanding. "Woman sitting in a cell today. Least this town can do is keep her father's memory out of an evidence bag." The sergeant hesitated, torn between procedure and decency. Before he could answer, a younger voice cut in from the hallway. "I can help with that, sir." Dale Whitfield stepped forward, dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who hadn't slept either. He'd logged the items himself the night before. He remembered every piece, exactly the way Walt had asked. "I documented her belongings myself," Dale said. "The pin's separate from the evidence tagged for the theft charge. I can release personal items not connected to the case, with a supervisor's approval." The sergeant studied him a moment, then shrugged. "Fine, get the paperwork. Make it quick." Dale disappeared into the back. He returned a few minutes later, carrying a small manila envelope. He handed it to Walt without a word, but something passed between them anyway. An understanding neither man needed to say out loud. "Thank you, son," Walt said quietly. "I just logged what I saw, sir. Nothing more. Sometimes that's everything." Walt studied the younger man a moment. "You feel all right about last night, Dale?" Dale hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir, not even a little." "Good," Walt said. "Man who feels fine about something like that has bigger problems. Hold on to that discomfort. It'll serve you better than any training academy ever could." Dale nodded slowly, something steadying behind his tired eyes. Walt walked out into the gray morning. The envelope stayed tucked inside his coat. He didn't open it until he reached the privacy of his truck. Inside sat the small silver star, exactly as he remembered it, exactly as he'd seen it pinned crooked to Joe's apron all week. He turned it over in his palm, studying it the way a man studies something he's held before, but never truly looked at. It felt heavier than costume jewelry had any right to feel. He pressed his thumb against the back of it, testing. Something gave slightly beneath the surface, a seam so fine it would have stayed invisible to anyone not looking for it. Walt's hands went still. He'd seen custom work like this exactly once before. 20 years ago, James Whitman showed him a small compartment built into an old cigarette case, a place to hide something worth protecting. James had always been careful that way, careful and quietly stubborn about insurance nobody else thought to keep. Walt worked the seam with the edge of his truck key. Gentle, patient, the way he'd been trained to handle evidence decades ago. The back panel of the star popped free after a moment. It revealed a tiny hollow compartment beneath. Inside sat a small data chip, no bigger than a fingernail, wrapped once in a scrap of faded cloth. Walt sat there in his truck a long moment, staring at it. His heart pounded harder than it had any business doing at his age. "You clever, stubborn man," he said softly, to a friend 20 years gone. "You knew, didn't you? You knew this day might come." He thought about all the mornings they'd spent on patrol together, trading terrible coffee and worse jokes. Neither of them imagining a moment like this one, waiting somewhere down the road. James had always played the long game, even back then, filing paperwork in triplicate, keeping copies nobody else bothered to keep. Walt used to tease him about it. He wasn't teasing now. 20 years of grief sat differently in Walt's chest all of a sudden, less like a wound that never closed, more like a debt finally coming due, one he intended to pay in full before the day was out. He thought, too, about the promise he'd made himself 3 nights back, standing in that dusty storage unit. He told himself then he was waiting for the right moment. Sitting here now, chip in hand, he understood the truth of it clearer than ever. He hadn't just been waiting. He'd been building toward exactly this morning. one quiet decision at a time, without fully admitting it to himself until now. He wrapped the chip carefully back in its cloth, slid it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Then he drove straight to the library. Evelyn Combs took one look at his face and locked the front door behind him. "Tell me," she said. He did. All of it. 20 years of questions. An officer's signature on a false weather report. A photograph of two young officers, grinning like they had the whole world ahead of them. And now a tiny chip, pulled from inside a dead man's badge. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her hands pressed flat against the counter, until he finished. "I remember James Whitman," Evelyn said quietly, once he'd finished. "He used to bring his little girl in here on Saturdays. Let her pick out any book she wanted, even the ones too old for her. Said a story should never feel out of reach." Walt hadn't known that detail. It settled into him gently. Another small piece of a man he'd missed for 20 years. "I've got an old recorder in the archive room," Evelyn said finally. "Predits digital everything. Might be able to read whatever's on that chip, if the format's old enough to match." It took nearly 20 minutes of careful work. Evelyn's steady hands guided cables and adapters older than half this town's residents. Then, from a small speaker, static crackled to life. Two voices followed. One older, patient, familiar even after 20 years. James Whitman's voice filled the small archive room. "This is Captain James Whitman, October the 14th. I'm recording this because I no longer trust it not to disappear otherwise." A second voice answered, younger, nervous, unmistakably Franklin Hayes. "You don't understand what you're asking, Captain. Reporting this ends careers, mine included. Taking bribes from Halstead Trucking already ended your career, son. You just haven't been told yet. I can make this go away. Nobody has to know." "I already know, Franklin. That's the problem." James's voice stayed calm, unshaken. Exactly the tone Walt remembered from 1,000 mornings on patrol together. "I'm giving you until Monday to come in and tell the truth yourself. After that, I file the report, and it goes to the state." "You don't know what you're doing," Franklin said, voice cracking with fear. "You don't know who's involved in this. It's bigger than me." "Then tell me, right now on this tape. Who's involved, Franklin?" A long pause followed, filled only with static and the faint sound of wind against a windshield. "Can't," Franklin said, finally, quieter now. "You don't understand what these people are capable of. I understand plenty. I understand a scared young man protecting himself instead of this badge. That's what I understand." James's voice never rose, never wavered. "Last chance, Franklin. Monday. Then it's bigger than both of us. Monday, Franklin." The recording ended there, static swallowing the last of it. Walt sat perfectly still, hands shaking now in a way they hadn't in years. "That conversation happened on a Thursday," he said quietly. "James died the following Tuesday night. Monday never came." Evelyn reached over and squeezed his arm, saying nothing. There was nothing adequate left to say. "I have to get this to the state," Walt said. "Today, before that ceremony." "You've been carrying this alone a long time, Walt. You don't have to carry it alone this morning, too, I know." "Thank you, Evelyn. Then you'd better hurry. It starts in 2 hours. Across town at the county courthouse." Joe sat across from a public defender. He looked barely older than Junie. They reviewed paperwork neither of them fully believed in. The door opened without a knock. A woman in a gray suit stepped inside, flashing credentials Joe recognized instantly. "Miss Callahan," the woman said, careful with the alias. "I'm here regarding your release." The public defender blinked, confused. "I wasn't informed of any change in status." "You will be shortly." The woman turned to Joe, something almost like respect in her eyes. "Director Ashford sends his regards. Captain, your release has been processed. Bail posted. Charges under state review, pending investigation into the arresting officer's conduct." Joe stood steady, calm, the way she'd been all week. "Is the team in position?" "In position, waiting on your signal. Director Ashford said to remind you. Whatever happens today happens in daylight, in front of witnesses. No shadows, no shortcuts. Understood? One more thing." The woman handed Joe a small folded note. "This came in 10 minutes ago, from a landline registered to the county library. A man named Walter Higgins is trying hard to reach you." Joe unfolded the note and read 3 words in Ashford's clipped handwriting. He found it. Something steadied in Joe's chest. Something that had been holding its breath for 7 long days. "Get me to the square," she said. "Now." They gave her 10 minutes in a small back office to change. A state-issued duffel bag sat waiting. The kind Ashford's office always kept ready for exactly this transition. Dark blazer, clean white shirt. Her actual credentials, folio and shield, sat unused for 7 days. She pinned the small silver star to her lapel before anything else, the same way she had every morning at the diner. Her hands moved a little steadier now, knowing what came next. The woman in the gray suit waited by the car outside. "Ready, Captain? Ready!" "For what it's worth," the woman said, pulling out of the lot. "I read your file before coming out here. 7 days undercover, minimal backup, active hostility from the subject's own family network. Most captains would have called for extraction after day 3. My father never called for extraction either," Joe said quietly. "Not once in 18 years on this job." The woman glanced at her, understanding settling in. "That's who we're really here for today, isn't it?" It always was. By 11 o'clock, the town square had filled with nearly every resident Millhaven had left. Folding chairs stood in careful rows. Bunting fluttered along the courthouse railing. The little brass band tuned up near the wooden stage, slightly off-key, exactly as it always was. Vendors had set up along the courthouse walkway, same as every year. Lemonade stands, homemade pie tables, a booth selling faded photographs of old Millhaven, back when the factory still ran 3 shifts, when the square held twice as many storefronts. Neighbors greeted neighbors with the easy warmth of people who'd known each other for life, trading small talk about weather and harvests, doing their best to ignore the tension humming underneath everything that morning. Word of Joe's arrest had reached every corner of the crowd by now. Most people had an opinion. Most people kept it to themselves, out of habit, out of politeness, out of the particular Midwestern reluctance to make a scene in public. They came anyway. Founders Day was Founders Day. This ceremony had happened every year of most of their lives. Some habits ran deeper than gossip. Franklin Hayes stood near the podium in his dress uniform, medals polished, speech tucked into his breast pocket. He looked out over the crowd, the practiced calm of a man who'd spent 30 years learning to appear untouchable. Grant stood near the front row, uneasy, scanning the crowd out of habit. He couldn't have said exactly what he was looking for. He found out a few minutes later, when Joe Callahan walked into the square. She moved through the crowd without hurry, without hesitation, dressed not in her waitress apron, but in something else entirely. A dark blazer, a state-issued badge, clipped openly to her belt for the first time all week. Whispers rippled outward ahead of her, like water parting around a stone. Rosie moved toward her first, pushing through the crowd, Junie close behind. "Joe," Rosie breathed. "What in the world?" "I need everyone to stay calm for a few minutes," Joe said quietly. "I promise there's an explanation coming." On the stage, Franklin faltered mid-sentence. His eyes locked onto the woman walking steadily toward him through his own ceremony. "Officer Hayes," Joe called out, her voice carrying clean across the square. "I think it's time this town learned who's actually standing in front of them." The crowd went silent. Every eye swung toward Franklin, then toward the calm young woman crossing the grass. Grant stepped forward, some old instinct kicking in. His hand reached for the cuffs at his belt out of pure reflex. "Ma'am, you need to leave the premises or I will arrest you again." "You could try," Joe said, "but I'd think carefully before you do." She reached into her jacket and produced a leather folio. She flipped it open for the crowd to see. A gold shield caught the midday light. Beside it sat a photo identification. Captain Josephine Whitman, State Bureau of Internal Affairs. The square erupted into murmurs, confused, disbelieving, electric. Near the front, Carl Osgood turned pale. He remembered what he'd said at the diner that morning. A few rows back, a farmer named Hollis Reed leaned toward his wife. He whispered that he'd known something was off about that boy for years. Rosie gripped Junie's hand tight enough to hurt. Both of them frozen, watching a story they thought they understood turn completely inside out. "Captain," Franklin repeated, the word barely making it out of his throat. "That's right, Chief Hayes. I was sent here 7 days ago to investigate a pattern of misconduct in this department. Multiple formal complaints, all against your son. All quietly buried, one way or another, before they reached my desk." Joe's voice stayed level, controlled, though something fierce burned behind her eyes now. "What I found instead was considerably larger than one bad officer." "This is insane," Grant said, looking to his father. "Dad, tell them this is insane." Franklin said nothing. Grant turned back to Joe. desperation creeping into his voice now. You lied to everyone in this town for a week. You lied to me. I never lied about who I was treating you like, Joe said. I treated you exactly the way you treated everyone weaker than you. Patiently, carefully, waiting to see if you'd learn anything on your own. I didn't do anything that badge doesn't allow. That badge doesn't allow bogus health inspections, Grant. It doesn't allow bullying a young woman for a taillight that worked fine. And it certainly doesn't allow planting marked bills in an innocent woman's bag. Not to save your own reputation. Joe's voice hardened just slightly. I have all of it documented. Every incident. Every witness. Grant opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Some of the fight visibly drained out of him. But Franklin wasn't looking at his son anymore. Franklin was looking past Joe toward the edge of the crowd. An old man in a good coat made his way slowly toward the stage. A small cloth-wrapped object rested carefully in one hand. Walt Higgins climbed the steps to the stage without asking permission from anyone. Franklin, Walt said, his voice carrying the weight of 31 years of shared history. I think you already know what I'm holding. Franklin's face went the color of old paper. Walt, whatever this is, we can talk about it later, privately. We had 20 years to talk about it privately, Walt said. You had every chance to come clean on your own. Instead, you let a good man's daughter grow up without her father. And you let this town keep calling you honorable. He held up the small cloth-wrapped chip. Beside it, a portable speaker Evelyn had lent him, already loaded and ready. This is a recording your predecessor made 20 years ago. Recorded on the same road where he died 4 days later. Walt's voice didn't shake, though everything in him wanted it to. I think this town deserves to hear it. Before you take one more oath on that stage. Don't, Franklin said. Quiet now, almost pleading. Please. You had a Monday to come clean, Franklin. Monday never came for James. It's come for you today. Walt pressed play. James Whitman's voice rolled out across the stunned town square, clear despite 20 years of silence, patient and unafraid, exactly the way everyone who'd known him remembered. This is Captain James Whitman. I'm recording this because I no longer trust it not to disappear otherwise. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the recording continued. Franklin's own younger voice followed moments later, unmistakable even 2 decades removed. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The little brass band stood frozen mid-note, instruments still raised. The truth Millhaven had buried for 20 years finally found its voice. When the recording ended, silence hung over the square like a held breath. Franklin stood motionless at the podium. His ceremony speech sat folded uselessly in his breast pocket. His whole career, his whole carefully built reputation, dissolved in real time, in front of every neighbor he'd ever known. I was 35 years old, Franklin said finally, his voice cracking wide open. I panicked. I never meant for it to go that far. I told myself for 20 years that it was an accident, that I hadn't meant for the guardrail, the ice, any of it. I told myself that lie so many times I almost believed it. Did you cause it, Franklin? Walt asked, quiet, steady. Or did you just let it happen and bury the truth afterward? Franklin didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. His silence, standing there in front of the whole town, answered clearly enough. State agents moved through the crowd now, unhurried, professional, converging on the stage from 3 directions at once. Joe nodded once toward the woman in the gray suit. The woman stepped forward with quiet authority. Franklin Hayes, you're being detained. Pending formal charges. Obstruction, falsifying official records, and conduct connected to the death of Captain James Whitman. Grant stood frozen at the base of the stage. He watched his father's hands get gently but firmly secured, watched 30 years of family legacy collapse in front of an entire town. Dad, he said, voice breaking, is any of this true? Franklin looked at his son a long moment. Something like genuine grief crossed his face for the first time all week. I never wanted you to know, he said quietly. I told myself I was protecting this family. I was only ever protecting myself. Franklin turned briefly toward Walt, still standing near the podium. 20 years I told myself you'd forgotten, moved on. Part of me hoped you had. I never forgot a single day, Walt said. I just didn't have the courage you're only now finding. This isn't courage, Franklin said, quiet, bitter. This is just a man too tired to keep carrying it. Sometimes that's where courage starts, Walt said, being too tired to keep lying to yourself. Franklin had nothing left to say to that. He let the agents guide him down the steps, past the folding chairs, past the very stage where he'd meant to stand as Millhaven's honored permanent chief. Grant's own arrest followed within minutes. Another agent stepped forward with a separate set of documents. Fabricated evidence in a theft investigation, intimidation of a witness, abuse of official authority during multiple traffic stops that same week. "This isn't fair," Grant said. The words sounded hollow even as he said them. Aimed at a crowd that had already stopped believing him, Dale Whitfield stepped forward from the edge of the gathering, his young face pale but resolute. "I can corroborate the theft charge, ma'am," he said, voice steady despite everything. "I was there. I logged the evidence myself. It was planted before we ever arrived at that diner. I should have said something sooner. I'm saying it now." The agent nodded, made a note, and thanked him for his honesty. Somewhere in the crowd, a few people began, quietly at first, to applaud. Grant looked at Dale like he didn't recognize him anymore. Maybe he never really had. They led Franklin and Grant Hayes away together, father and son, through a crowd that parted in silence, past the folding chairs, past the courthouse steps, past 20 years of a town's misplaced trust finally coming due. As they reached the patrol car, Grant paused. He looked back once at the diner side of the square. Rosie and Junie stood watching. Something in his expression shifted, just slightly. The arrogance finally cracking under the weight of everything he'd lost. "Tell her I'm sorry," he said to nobody in particular. Everyone nearby understood exactly who he meant. For the coffee. For all of it. Nobody answered him. But Rosie heard it anyway. Something in her chest loosened, just a little, hearing it. The formal charges would take weeks to fully resolve. The state agent explained as much later that day. Once the crowd had mostly gone home, Franklin faced obstruction, falsifying records, and a reopened investigation. His role in James Whitman's death under review at last. Prosecutors would weigh exactly how far those charges could reach after 2 full decades. Grant faced his own separate list, evidence tampering, chief among them, plus several counts connected to intimidating witnesses that same week. Neither man would wear a badge in Millhaven again. That much at least was settled by nightfall. Hollis Reed found his way to the front of the thinning crowd, cane tapping soft against the courthouse steps. He'd farmed this county for 50 years, buried 2 wives, rarely said much of anything in public. Today he made an exception. Knew something was wrong with that boy the day he got his badge, Hollis said, to whoever was listening. Just never had proof enough to say it out loud. Man my age learns to keep his suspicions to himself mostly. Maybe that was the wrong lesson all along. Nobody answered him directly, but a few heads nodded. The same quiet acknowledgement that had passed through the diner all week. Recognition arriving a little late. The way it so often did, in a town built on politeness over confrontation. Carl Osgood found Rosie in the crowd a moment later, hat in his hands. He looked considerably smaller than he had that morning. "I was wrong about her," Carl said. "Wrong to say what I said." "You were," Rosie agreed without much heat left in her voice. "Buy her a coffee sometime, tell her yourself." "I intend to." Mildred Vance stood near the front of the crowd, watching the state vehicles pull away. Something between grief and vindication crossed her face both at once. 31 years my husband wore a badge, Mildred said, mostly to herself. "I always hoped it still meant something in this town. Today, I believe it again." Junie found Rosie a moment later, eyes red, voice unsteady with everything she was still processing. "I keep thinking about that citation. If Joe hadn't caught the mistake in it, none of this comes out this way." "Maybe not," Rosie said. "But it did come out. That's what matters now." "I know. I just keep thinking how close it came to not happening." Rosie pulled her into a hug, the kind she'd given Junie since the girl could barely reach the counter. "Close doesn't count against you, honey. Only what actually happens does. And what happened today, this town is going to remember for a long, long time." Rosie found Joe a few minutes later, standing near the edge of the emptying square, watching the last state vehicles pull away. "Captain, is it?" Rosie asked, something warm breaking through her shock. "For now, yes. Effective immediately, as far as this department goes." Joe managed a tired smile. "There's still a great deal of work ahead, Rosie. Rebuilding trust doesn't happen in one afternoon." "No," Rosie agreed, "but it starts somewhere. Might as well start today. State's appointing an interim chief while the review runs its course," Joe added. "For now, that's me." Dale Whitfield staying on. Every other officer gets reviewed individually starting Monday. And after that? After that, this town gets to decide what kind of department it wants going forward. Not me. Not the state. You. All of you. Joe looked around the square at neighbors still gathered in stunned little clusters. A badge only means something if the people wearing it remember who they answer to. Rosie nodded slowly, taking that in. Your father would have said something just like that. He did say something just like that. More than once. Dale Whitfield approached hesitantly, still in uniform, still pale from the morning's events. Captain, I want you to know, I'll cooperate with whatever review you need. Fully. I already know that, Dale. You proved it up there on that stage, in front of everyone. Joe studied him a moment. You've got good instincts. You just needed somebody willing to actually use theirs first. That won't be a problem going forward. Dale nodded, something like relief crossing his tired face. Thank you, Captain. Get some sleep tonight. Monday's going to be a long day for both of us. Junie hugged Joe hard enough to nearly knock her over, laughing and crying at the same time. Mildred Vance simply stood nearby, nodding slowly, satisfied in the quiet way of someone who'd waited a long time to see decency win. My husband used to say a town earns the badge it keeps. Mildred said it mostly to herself. I've spent 30 years wondering if this town had stopped expecting anything better. Has it? Joe asked gently. Today, I'm not so sure anymore. Mildred's eyes were wet, though her voice stayed steady. Today, I think this town remembered it deserved better than that. Walt approached last. The small silver star still resting in his palm, its hidden compartment closed once more. I believe this belongs to you, he said, holding it out. Joe took it carefully, turning it over once in her fingers, feeling its familiar weight settle back into her hand. Thank you, Walt, for everything. For 20 years of carrying this, even when you didn't know exactly what you were carrying. Your father was the finest man I ever served beside, Walt said, voice thick. I should have fought harder for him back then. I'm sorry it took me so long. You fought for him today, Joe said. That's what matters now. I fought for him the moment I decided to wait for the right one. Walt looked toward the courthouse, then back at her. Turns out patience was the fight all along. I just needed somebody like you to remind an old man what it looks like. Joe smiled, tired but genuine. You were never just an old man to me, Walt. Not from that first morning you watched me a little too closely. Caught me staring, did you? Every time. She pinned the star back to her lapel, careful, the way she always did. Best kind of watching this town's had in 20 years, turns out. That evening, Rosie's diner stayed open late, packed wall to wall with a town still working through everything that had happened. Coffee flowed freely, most of it on the house. Laughter mixed with quiet disbelief. The particular sound of a community exhaling after holding its breath too long. Junie found Joe near the counter, wiping down a spot that was already clean. Unable to sit still with everything still buzzing through her. You could have told me, Junie said. That night on the shoulder of Route 9, you could have flashed that badge and made it all stop right there. I could have, Joe agreed. But it wouldn't have gotten Franklin. It would have just gotten Grant angrier, given him time to bury things deeper before Saturday came. That's a heavy thing to carry alone all week. I wasn't as alone as I felt, Joe said. She glanced toward Walt's booth, toward Rosie, toward Mildred still sitting quiet near the window. Turns out this town had my back before I even knew it. Dwayne Pratt came by near closing, sober and steady. Hat in his hands, the way Carl's had been that morning. Wanted to say thank you properly, he said. For that night with the knife, for not treating me like a problem. You already thanked me plenty, Dwayne. Wanted to say it again, now that I know who I was thanking. He managed a small, embarrassed smile. Captain, just Joe still. Far as this diner's concerned, she said, that hasn't changed. Behind the counter, Rosie cleared a small space on the wall, near the old cash register, a spot that had held nothing but a faded calendar for years. She hung a small wooden frame there instead. One Walt had built that very afternoon, glass front polished until it shone. Inside it, resting on a bed of soft cloth, sat a small silver star, pinned exactly the way James Whitman used to wear it, slightly off-center. A straight pin was for men who didn't have anything better to worry about. Beneath it, on a small brass plaque, Rosie had one line engraved. For those who wait, and those who finally stand. Joe stood in front of it a long moment that evening, coffee cooling in her hand, the whole diner alive with warmth around her. A week ago, She'd walked through that door a stranger, carrying a secret and a grief nobody in this town knew to look for. Tonight, she stood among neighbors who finally understood exactly who she was, and exactly what her patience had cost her, and exactly what it had ultimately protected. Her father used to say that right takes longer than mean, but right is the only kind that holds up the next morning. Millhaven had learned that lesson too this Founder's Day. The hard way, the way most important lessons tend to arrive. Outside, the last of the bunting fluttered gently in the evening breeze, red, white, and blue against a darkening sky. Somewhere down the block, the courthouse clock struck 9, slow and steady, counting out a new beginning. A town that had finally remembered how to stand up straight. 3 weeks later, Rosie's diner looked much the same as it always had. Same checkered floor, worn soft in the same familiar paths. Same bell over the door, ringing steady all morning long. But something in the town felt different, lighter somehow. The way a house feels once a long-held secret finally gets aired out. Jo still stopped in most mornings. She wore her actual uniform now, badge pinned openly where everyone could see it. Junie had started night classes toward her nursing degree, 2 evenings a week. Funded in part by a scholarship Rosie set up in Dell's name, Dale Whitfield had been promoted to lead a new community outreach program. His idea, born from a guilt he'd finally learned to turn into something useful. Walt still came in every morning at 7:15. 2 eggs over easy, rye toast, the paper read front to back. But some mornings now, he brought a second cup of coffee, set it beside the small silver star in its frame. "Morning, old friend," he'd say quiet, to nobody watching. "Wish you could see how this turned out." Nobody in the diner ever teased him for it. Some things this town had learned deserved honoring exactly the way a person needed. Mildred Vance still came in every day at 7. Same booth, same order. But she talked more now than she used to, telling stories about her husband to anyone willing to listen. Stories about 31 honest years wearing a badge. A town that had finally remembered what honest looked like. The department itself looked different too 3 weeks in. New complaint procedures, posted openly on the station bulletin board. A community advisory board, meeting monthly at the courthouse, made up of ordinary residents, no badge, no political favors to protect. Small changes, most of them, the kind that rarely made headlines anywhere else. Evelyn Combs kept the old microfilm machine a while longer than planned, despite the library board's talk of finally replacing it. Somebody ought to remember the town's history the slow, careful way. She told them that, and left it there. Walt still stopped by most weeks, not for records anymore, just for coffee and conversation. 2 people who'd shared a single terrible morning, choosing to keep sharing ordinary ones afterward. But in Millhaven, small changes were exactly what the town had been waiting on, whether it fully realized it or not. Franklin Hayes sat in a county holding facility 2 towns over, awaiting formal trial. His dress uniform long since replaced by a plain gray jumpsuit. He had visitors twice a week, never Grant. The 2 of them had not spoken since the square. Some debts, it turned out, ran too deep for a single confession to settle. It was a small town, easy to overlook on most maps. Easy for the rest of the world to drive past without a second glance. It had made mistakes the way every town does. It had looked away when looking away felt easier. It had let fear and habit stand in for courage, more times than anyone wanted to count. But it had also produced a diner owner who never stopped believing in a stranger. A retired officer who carried 20 years of guilt, until he finally set it down right. A young waitress who found her own courage on an empty road at night. An old widow who remembered exactly what a good badge was supposed to look like. She refused to settle for less. Even a nervous young officer who chose honesty over comfort, standing in front of the whole town when it mattered most. None of them were extraordinary people, not in any way the world usually measures. They were just ordinary neighbors, choosing, one small decision at a time, to be decent when decency was hard. That, in the end, was the only kind of courage most towns ever really needed. Once, a long time ago, a man had crouched down to a little girl's level. He told her that right takes longer than mean. He never lived to see how right that lesson turned out to be, but his daughter carried it faithfully. Across 20 years and 100 small tests, into a diner in a town she barely remembered, and out the other side of it, into daylight. Millhaven, 3 weeks into a new beginning, was still learning how to stand up straight. It would take longer than a single Founder's Day, longer than a single confession on a wooden stage. But the town had proven at least once that it still knew how. And in a place this small, that was already enough. Enough to build the next 20 years on. Some mornings, Rosie still catches herself glancing toward the door around 7:15, half expecting to see a quiet stranger walk in, wearing a borrowed name. What she sees instead is better. Neighbors, some of them a little braver than they used to be. A diner that stayed open when it counted. A town remembering one ordinary morning at a time. Exactly what it was capable of all along.